So before we move on from useEffect, I wanted to show you this hooks flow diagram created by my friend Donovan. You can find it on GitHub, but it's a really great representation of the flow of what React is doing over time for your React components, and hopefully this can help you visualize the way that your React components mount and update and unmount, and the order in which things are run. And then I'm going to show you the example here that I have for our little demo that you can absolutely play around with. So the way that hooks work is we start out with our lazy initializers. That's the function API for useState, where you pass in a function, and that's what we call a lazy initializer. So when our component is mounting to the page, when it's first being rendered, it's never been on the page before, the first thing that React is going to do is it's going to run those lazy initializers. And then it's going to run the rest of our render function. So that's all of the contents of our function where that useState resides. And then it's going to do updating of the DOM. So we say, hey, React, I want you to put a div right here. React is going to say, okay, cool. Let me make that div. That's what React updates the DOM is all about. And then at that point, it's going to run layout effects, which you'll learn about in the future. But this is basically like a useEffect callback. It's very similar, just slight differences. We can learn about that later. So after it runs the layout effects, then React is going to just stop running and say, hey, browser, by the way, I updated the DOM. Why don't you go ahead and paint the screen? What that means is the browser says, oh, cool, I've got some DOM updates. So let me take those DOM updates and show the user what those DOM updates were. So there's a period of time between when you actually add a class name to an element and when the user sees that change reflected in what is being shown to them. And so that process is called painting. And so that's what happens as soon as React updates the DOM and then runs your layout effects. It will allow the browser to paint the screen, and then it runs your effects. So updating local storage or whatever it is that you're doing. And then we just hang out and wait for the user to do some sort of interaction or some subscription to update or whatever. Ultimately, we get some sort of state update, and that triggers an update. So then we go through this process. We don't run those lazy initializers this time, and instead just run the contents of the component function, and that's the render phase. And then React will update the DOM again, saying, hey, DOM, we need to update this class name or add this div or whatever. And then React will actually run what's called the cleanup phase for our layout effects. And we'll look at that in our example here in just a second. Once it runs those cleanups, then it will run the layout effects. It will yield to the browser to say, hey, browser, I made some updates to the DOM. Why don't you show those to the user? The browser's like, cool, thanks, React. And then once the browser's done updating the screen, then React will say, hey, I'm going to go clean up any side effects that we had in the last render. And then I'm going to run all of the new effects that need to be run in this render. And then ultimately, the user navigates away from the page, or we click on a checkbox and something goes away. Somehow, a component gets removed from the screen. So all that happens in that phase, it's called unmounting. All that is going to happen is a cleanup of our layout effects and then a cleanup of our effects. So with all of this as kind of the backdrop for this, we have this example hookflow.js. You can find it in the examples directory. You can pull this up right here at that URL. And we've got two components in here. One is the child, and I have a bunch of console logs in here with different color coding so that you can follow along what's going on in our app. So we've got a console log in the render. We've got a console log in a lazy initializer. We've got one in a useEffect. And then the useEffect is returning a function, and that is our cleanup function. So if you return a function from a useEffect, then React will call that when it's time to clean up that useEffect. And then we have three different versions of useEffect. So here's one with no dependencies. Here's one with an array of empty dependencies, so also no dependencies, but we're explicitly saying we do not depend on anything, whereas with no dependencies listed even, we're saying we depend on everything. And then this useEffect here has a single dependency, so we'll be able to compare how those different things are running. And then we're going to create our element, we'll log that we've finished rendering, and then we'll return that element. And the app is basically the exact same thing. It just manages a little different state here where our child manages a state for the count. The app here is managing state for whether or not it should show the child, but we're still getting the console log for render start and for our useState update for 3 use effects, each with a different variation on dependencies, each with a cleanup, and then we create our element for the UI. We log that we finished, and then we return that element. So right from the get-go, once we get onto the page, we're going to start out with this mount phase for our app. So right here, we're going to see we have app render start. That's the first thing that happens. And then we get a useState equals false. So this is our lazy initializer right here. So we get this logged, and then we call React useState, and immediately React says, oh, okay, cool, you gave me a function. Let me just call that right away so that I know what to give you in my return value for this show child value. So it does call that immediately. And then we call all of these use effects, but you'll notice that the console logs inside of those are not actually being called until after we call all of them, after we create the elements, and then we log that we've finished rendering. So once our render is all done, we finished our rendering, React updates the DOM, it runs the layout effects, and then the browser paints the screen, and then it runs our effects. And that's what we're getting right here. These 3 effects, all 3 of them are going to run. And so that's cool. Let's go ahead and trigger an update so we see what happens in this case. So I'm going to highlight this one so we remember that's where we were at. And then I'm going to click show child. That will trigger a re-render because that's a state update. So we get app render start, and you'll remember that's the first thing that happens here. And then we get app render end. So we no longer are getting our lazy initializer here with this use state. That's not going to happen anymore because it's a lazy initializer and it's only for the initialization of our app component. But then something that is kind of interesting, may take you by surprise, is that we get this render end, but this time we're actually rendering the child, right? So shouldn't the child get called first, right? We have our render for the child. That should happen before the render of the app finishes. And this is a really important point. Just because you're creating a React element of a specific type doesn't mean that React is actually going to call into that function. When you do this, remember, you're calling React create element child. That's what that line is doing. So you're not calling the function. You're not saying child invoke. No, that's not what's going on. You're just creating an element that is of type child, and React is the one that's responsible for calling it. So React does not call it until it's actually time to do the rendering. And that's an important point to keep in mind, because you could do child and like do a million of these, and if those are never actually rendered, then you're never going to see that child getting called. But we are in fact rendering this child. It does ultimately need to be rendered to the page, and when React gets to that point, it comes up here and we get a call of the child rendered start. There it is right there. And then we have our lazy initializer for useState. So that's what's going on right here. We call this useState. And because this is a mount, we're going to call our lazy initializer immediately. And we can take a look at that. So what we experienced with the app right here is an update. And then what we're experiencing with the child is a mount. So keep those differences in mind. So that's why we're getting this lazy initializer. And then we call all of these use effects. We create our element. And then we finish rendering right here. And then React says, okay, cool. So we've mounted this thing. What's the next step? We need to let the browser paint the screen, and then we'll run all of the effects. So that's what happens here next, is it takes all of these effects and runs those effect callbacks. So once the child is all done, running all 3 of those effect callbacks for the mount, then the app parent can run through its next phase. So let's take a look at that hook flow. Remember, the app is here. We ran the render for this component, and then we started the mount for the child. And now we're continuing here with updating the DOM, where we need to clean the layout effects, run the layout effects. We don't have any of those. Remember, that's for future lesson. And then the browser painted the screen, and now we're going to run the cleanup of the effects. So that's why we're seeing this use effect with no dependencies getting cleaned up, because it's going to rerun those effects on every single re-render of this component. Every update is going to rerun those effect callbacks. And so if the effect callback needs to be run, then it needs to run the cleanup first. So that's why we're getting both of these, where this one has no dependencies. So we're basically saying this needs to rerun on every render, whereas this one has a single dependency, and that dependency changed, so that also needs to be cleaned up. So once both of those cleanups run, then we can run the use effect callback and synchronize the state of the world with the state of our app. In our case, that is simply logging to the console. Great, so let's go ahead and do an update on the child. So here we have a button. When we click the button, we're going to get this set count to update the count based on the previous value for the count. And that should trigger a re-render of the child. So let's take a look at that. I'm just going to highlight this really quick so we can keep track of that. I'll click this once. Boom, we get a re-render. And one thing that you'll notice right here is that the child re-rendered, but the app did not. So the app does not care at all about what is happening in the child. The app is just like totally isolated from the render updates of the child. So because the state update happened within the child, that's where our re-render is going to happen. So we start with the render start. Remember, no lazy initializer here because this is an update. And according to our hooks chart, we don't get lazy initializers run on updates. And then we call all of these use effects, but those do not get logged immediately. Instead, we log that the child render end happened. And then we call the cleanups for our use effects. So just like we did with our app here, we're now saying, hey, this use effect runs on every single render, so I need to clean that up. And hey, this use effect runs whenever the count changed. It did, so I need to clean that up. And once those cleanups happen, then we can run the use effect callbacks again to synchronize the state of the world with the state of our app. All right, finally, let's take a look at this unmount cycle right here. So presumably all that should happen is cleanup layout effects, which we don't have, and cleanup effects, which we do. So let's take a look at what happens when I uncheck the show child. That show child will no longer be rendered to the page. Instead, we'll just render null. So let's take a look at what happens. Let me highlight this and then uncheck show child. Boom. There we go. Okay. So what happened here is there was a state update inside of the app. And so that's why the app itself gets re-rendered. So we start the render and we finish the render. And then the child is like, whoa, I'm leaving, I'm out, I'm getting unmounted from the page. So we've got to run the cleanup for everything. So even though the count didn't change, even though this doesn't have any dependencies, every one of these is going to have the cleanup phase run because we are unmounting. And then because there was a state change and we have some use effects that rely on that state, we're going to run those use effects cleanup for the use effect that depends on everything and the use effect that depends on the thing that changed. And then we'll run the effect callbacks for both of those. So if this was a little bit fast for you or it was a little confusing or something, I strongly recommend that you come in here and you play around with things, you add some additional console logs or whatever you want to do to kind of explore this. It's not totally necessary for you to understand the flow of all of your hooks, but it does help sometimes to understand what order things are run in. And so definitely spend a little bit of time playing around with this example. And you can use this as a reference anytime you are a little bit confused about the order in which these hooks are going to be run.